For most of its modern history, the British monarchy has operated on a simple but extraordinarily effective principle. The less you know, the better. Not as a formal policy, not as something written down in any official document that you could point to and say, here, this is where they decided to keep everything secret, but as a deep institutional instinct refined over generations, embedded in the legal architecture of the British state in ways so thorough and so far-reaching that most people don't even realize how much they don't know. The royal household is exempt from the Freedom of Information Act. The Royal Archive at Windsor is treated as a private family archive rather than a public record, accessible only at the institution's own discretion, with historians comparing the level of secrecy to that of the CIA or MI5. Royal wills are sealed for decades after death. The costs of royal travel below a certain threshold don't need to be reported at all. Correspondence between the royal household and government departments is covered by an absolute exemption from disclosure rules. In short, the monarchy has built around itself, over centuries, one of the most comprehensive and legally robust systems of information control possessed by any institution in British public life. And for most of that history, it worked almost perfectly. What the public didn't know, the public couldn't challenge. What the public couldn't challenge, the institution didn't have to change. But something has shifted in the past several years, and especially in the past several months. The walls are coming down, not all at once, and not without resistance. But piece by piece, document by document, file by file, the secrets of the British royal family are coming to light in ways that would have been almost unimaginable even a decade ago. And the picture that's emerging from behind those walls is considerably more complicated, considerably more human, and in some cases considerably more troubling than the carefully managed public image would ever have suggested. The single most consequential disclosure of recent months, the one that set everything else in motion, began not in London, but in Washington, D.C., when the United States Department of Justice released its final and largest tranche of files related to the convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein on the 30th of January this year. 3 million documents, 3 million pages of emails, correspondence, financial records, photographs, and internal communications from the orbit of a man who had spent decades cultivating relationships with some of the most powerful and connected people in the world, and who had died in a federal jail cell in 2019 while awaiting trial on sex trafficking charges. The British royal connection to Epstein had, of course, been public knowledge for years, centered on Andrew Mountbatten Windsor's long and extensively documented friendship with a man who was, by the time that friendship became widely known, already a convicted sex offender. But what most people expected from a final document release, even a large one, was more of the same. More photographs of Andrew and Epstein together at social events, more correspondence establishing their personal closeness, more evidence of the kind of reckless personal judgment that had already cost Andrew so much. What they got instead was something considerably more serious and considerably more constitutionally significant than a social scandal. Buried within those 3 million documents were emails that appeared to show Andrew, in his official capacity as the United Kingdom's special representative for international trade and investment, forwarding sensitive government material directly to Epstein. The first email, dated the 30th of November 2010, showed Andrew forwarding official visit reports from a 2-week tour he had recently completed of Southeast Asia, covering Singapore, Hong Kong, Vietnam, and Shenzhen in China, to Epstein just minutes after receiving those reports from his own special advisor, Amit Patel. The sender in the email chain was labeled simply the Duke. The reports themselves were described as the visit reports for Vietnam, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Shenzhen in relation to your recent visit to Southeast Asia. The second email, sent the following month, appeared to show Andrew sharing what he described in his own words as a confidential brief, a document concerning potential investment opportunities in Helmand province in southern Afghanistan, at that time an active conflict zone where British and Allied forces were deployed in significant numbers. The specific detail that this material related to Afghanistan, to a war zone, to a region where British military personnel were serving and dying at that very moment, transformed the story from a question of personal judgment into something with potential national security implications that were of a genuinely different order. Within 3 weeks of that document release, Thames Valley Police had assessed the material, determined that a formal investigation was warranted, and on the 19th of February, Andrew's 66th birthday, arrived at his Norfolk residence and arrested him on suspicion of misconduct in public office. He was held for much of that day before being released as the investigation continued. And in the days that followed, the British Parliament did something that it had not done in years, and that the royal household had managed to avoid for most of its modern history. It forced the government to release classified documents. The mechanism used was a parliamentary procedure called a humble address, a little used but genuinely powerful tool by which Parliament can compel a government minister to produce specific documents for public scrutiny. The Liberal Democrats deployed it specifically to demand the release of previously confidential files relating to Andrew's appointment as trade envoy back in 2001. The government backed the motion. It passed without opposition, and on the 22nd of May, Trade Minister Chris Bryant stood in Parliament and released those documents to the public, with the stated intention of meeting what he described as the least we owe the victims of the horrific abuse perpetrated by Jeffrey Epstein and others. What those documents revealed, when they were finally read by journalists and constitutional experts, contained details that had never been publicly known before, and that immediately reframed the entire story in a significant way. The most striking single revelation was a letter in which the head of Britain's trade body wrote that the Queen is very keen that the Duke of York should take on a prominent role in the promotion of national interests. A direct statement in an official document that had been classified for 25 years that Queen Elizabeth II herself had been actively enthusiastic about Andrew's appointment as trade envoy. This was not rumor or implication or something read between the lines of a carefully managed royal statement. It was a plain declarative sentence in an official government letter, stating that the late monarch's personal enthusiasm had been a driving factor in giving her son a role that he then, according to the evidence now being examined by police, used to share confidential government material with a convicted sex offender. The implications of that revelation ripple outward in multiple directions simultaneously. They speak to the question of how much protection Andrew received from within the institution throughout the years when his conduct was already causing concern. They speak to the broader question of how the monarchy's informal influence over official government appointments and decisions operates, and how rarely that influence is publicly visible. And they speak to the particular painful complexity of Queen Elizabeth's legacy, which has always included, alongside her extraordinary personal dedication and her genuine popularity, a well-documented tendency to be slow, sometimes very slow, in addressing the behavior of members of her own family when that behavior created problems for the institution. The documents also revealed something that has generated its own serious wave of political concern. Trade Minister Bryant confirmed, in his statement to Parliament accompanying the document release, that his department had found no evidence that a formal due diligence or vetting process was undertaken when Andrew was appointed as special trade envoy. No evidence that this was even considered. A senior royal with access to sensitive government briefings, trade mission reports, and confidential investment analyses appointed to an official government role without any formal security vetting process whatsoever. The Liberal Democrat Chief Whip Wendy Chamberlain called this shocking and deeply troubling. It raises serious questions, she said, about why officials and ministers at the time thought that was acceptable. And it opens up a genuinely significant question about how many other informal appointments involving members of the royal family in areas touching sensitive government material have been made over the years without the kind of due diligence that would be standard practice for any other individual in any comparable role. The wider context of all this is also important because Andrew's situation doesn't exist in isolation. The same final tranche of Epstein files that triggered Andrew's arrest also contained material relating to Peter Mandelson, the former labor minister who had more recently been serving as Britain's ambassador to the United States before being forced to resign. Mandelson was subsequently arrested on suspicion of misconduct in public office, bringing the total number of prominent British figures arrested in connection with this document released to 2, the former prince and the former ambassador, and adding a dimension to the story that goes well beyond a simple royal scandal into a broader reckoning with how an entire class of powerful, well-connected British men had used their proximity to Epstein and their confidence in their own untouchability to conduct themselves in ways that are now being subjected to the scrutiny they apparently never expected to face. The Liberal Democrats' description of this as a stain that needed to be cleaned with the disinfectant of transparency captured something genuinely important about the public mood around all of this. After decades of watching powerful people operate in comfortable, consequence-free darkness, there is a real, visceral appetite for exactly the kind of forced transparency that parliamentary motions, document releases, and criminal investigations now represent. But the Epstein files and the trade envoy documents are only the most immediate and most dramatic example of the broader pattern of royal secrets coming to light that has been building for years. Because the system of royal secrecy that has protected the institution for generations is itself under sustained, serious, and increasingly effective challenge across multiple fronts simultaneously. The campaign organization Republic, which advocates for the abolition of the monarchy, has been running what it calls its Royal Secrets campaign for several years, documenting in careful detail the extraordinary range of exemptions, exclusions, and protections that the royal household enjoys from the disclosure and accountability rules that apply to virtually every other public institution in Britain. Their research, and the research of journalists and academics working in this area, has revealed a picture of systematic, legally entrenched information control that most people have no idea exists. The royal household is not just exempt from the Freedom of Information Act in the way that, say, a small private charity might be exempt. It is actively, specifically excluded by name, meaning that you cannot make an FOI request to Buckingham Palace or to any other royal household body, full stop. Any information or communication about the royals held by other public bodies, government departments, local councils, police forces is also covered by an absolute exemption from disclosure rules. Not a qualified exemption that can be overridden by a public interest test, but an absolute one, meaning that even if there is a compelling public interest in disclosure, the exemption still stands. This is the only area of British public life, other than the intelligence services themselves, where an absolute information exemption of this kind applies. The Royal Archive at Windsor, which contains tens of thousands of official documents relating to the monarch's role as head of state, is classified as a private family archive rather than a public record. This means it is not governed by the same rules that apply to cabinet papers and other official historical documents, which are routinely released to the National Archive after a set period of years. Royal documents don't have a standard release schedule. They are disclosed or not, at the discretion of the royal household itself. Historians who have attempted to research 20th century royal history have increasingly complained about the difficulty of gaining access, with some comparing the experience to trying to access material from the intelligence agencies. And crucially, the kinds of documents being withheld aren't simply personal correspondence or private family letters, which could reasonably be protected as genuinely private. They include official documents relating to the monarch's exercise of constitutional powers, correspondence with government ministers, and records of the royal household's interventions in public policy and legislation. In other words, material that in any other democratic context would be considered a public record and treated accordingly. Then there is the question of what Republic's researchers have called royal lobbying, an area where the gap between what the public is entitled to know and what actually happens is, by any democratic standard, genuinely alarming. The royal family is known to lobby government on a range of policy areas, from planning and environmental regulations to health and education. What's known publicly about this lobbying is almost entirely the result of occasional leaks and investigative journalism rather than any formal disclosure system. The most notorious example is what became known as the Black Spider Memos, the personal handwritten letters that Prince Charles, as he then was, sent to government ministers over many years on a range of topics reflecting his personal opinions and causes, letters that were eventually released after a decade-long legal battle by the Guardian newspaper, and that revealed the future king commenting directly on government policy in ways that raised serious questions about the constitutional propriety of such interventions. Those letters came to light not because the system worked as it should, but because journalists fought for years through the courts to get them. Take away that kind of sustained, expensive investigative effort, and the correspondence stays hidden indefinitely. And then there are the royal wills, which are routinely sealed for decades following the death of a royal family member, with access restricted by a legal process that effectively gives the Court of Appeal discretion to extend that secrecy as long as the court sees fit. The late Duke of Edinburgh's will was sealed for 90 years. The legal arguments offered for this kind of extended secrecy are usually grounded in protecting the dignity of the royal family and avoiding intrusion into the sovereign's private affairs. But critics have pointed out that when those wills involve the distribution of assets that may have been accumulated in ways connected to public roles, and may also reveal the financial relationships within a family whose public funding from the sovereign grant is itself a matter of public money, the privacy argument becomes considerably more contested. The significance of all this royal secrecy coming under pressure is genuinely historical because for most of the 20th century, the system was simply accepted as part of the natural order of British public life. The monarchy was understood to occupy a category of special protected privacy that existed above the ordinary rules of democratic accountability, and most people, including most politicians and most journalists, went along with that understanding without seriously challenging it. What's changed is a combination of factors that together are proving more powerful than any of them individually. The internet and social media have created new channels for investigative journalism and for the public circulation of documents and information that institutions can no longer easily suppress simply by maintaining good relationships with traditional media gatekeepers. The Epstein investigation, conducted primarily by American prosecutors and journalists, working within an American legal framework that is considerably less deferential to British institutional sensitivities than the British press has historically been, has produced document releases that bypass the entire British system of royal information control entirely. The parliamentary mechanism of the humble address, a procedure so rarely used that most MPs had forgotten it existed, has been dusted off and deployed to force disclosure of material the government would almost certainly otherwise have kept classified. And the public mood around accountability and transparency has shifted in ways that make the old arguments for special royal exemptions from ordinary disclosure rules feel increasingly difficult to sustain. What's emerging from all of this is not, despite what the most dramatic coverage sometimes implies, a picture of a fundamentally corrupt institution riddled with hidden crimes and systematic cover-ups. It's more complicated and more human than that. It's the picture of an institution that built its information controls in a different era under different social and political assumptions about the relationship between powerful institutions and public accountability. And that has been extraordinarily slow to recognize that those assumptions have changed fundamentally around it. An institution that has relied on secrecy not primarily because it has specific dramatic things to hide, though some of what's now coming to light is genuinely troubling, but because secrecy was simply the water it swam in, the environment it had always operated within, and because nobody with the authority to change that had ever had sufficient reason or sufficient pressure to do so. Until now. Because what the events of the past several months have demonstrated, with unusual clarity, is that the old system of protection is no longer reliably holding. Documents that were classified for 25 years are now public. Emails forwarded in private correspondence are now the subject of a police investigation. A parliamentary procedure that the institution probably never seriously worried about is now being used to compel disclosure. And the American justice system, operating entirely outside the reach of British royal influence, has released 3 million documents that contain material nobody in the royal household had any ability to suppress. Royal secrets are finally coming to light. Not all of them, and not all at once. The archive at Windsor still holds its tens of thousands of documents. The FOI exemption is still in place. The absolute exemption for royal correspondence in other public bodies' hands is still the law. But the confidence with which the institution once maintained its wall of information control is genuinely shaken, and the pressure on that wall from outside is greater now than at any point in the monarchy's modern history. What comes through that wall next, and how the institution responds to it, will say a great deal about whether the British monarchy is capable of the transparency that democratic accountability increasingly demands, or whether it will continue to reach for the same familiar tools of silence and legal exemption until those tools are finally taken from its hands by forces it can no longer control.